Today we discuss about service container concept in Laravel. So in this we are having main topics like introduction, binding, resolving, method invocation and injection, container events, PSR 11. So all these are main topics, and the subtopics we are having like zero configuration resolution, when to utilize the container, binding basics, binding interfaces to implementations, contextual binding, contextual attributes, binding primitives, binding typed variadics, tagging, extending bindings, the make method, automatic injection, rebinding. So let's see one by one. So the introduction part, the Laravel service container is a powerful tool for managing class dependencies and performing dependency injection. So dependency injection means class dependencies are injected into the class via the constructor or in some cases setter methods. So when to utilize the service container. So if I want to, for example, if I want to use a request object, then we will be typing the request class by using use keyword, use illuminate HTTP request, and then we will be using request object as per the requirement within the router or in the controller. So mainly service container contains topics like binding, resolving, invocation and injection, and events, and the PSR 11 interface. So these are the main topics, and let's see binding concept. So binding means how do we bind a class or interface into the service container. So we are having different methods like binding. Let's see one by one. So bind method. So bind method is used to bind a class or interface into the service container. We may use bind if method to register a container binding only if a binding has not already been registered for the given type. And we are having next method, singleton method. Singleton method binds a class or interface into the container that should only be resolved one time. And next we have singleton if method. So singleton if method is used to register a singleton container binding only if a binding has not already been registered for the given type. So it will check whether it is already been registered or not. Next, binding scoped singletons. The scoped method binds a class or interface into the container that should only be resolved one time within a given Laravel request or job lifecycle, either request lifecycle or job cycle. So during that per request or per job lifecycle, it will bind a class or interface into the container, the scoped method. Now we have seen how do we bind a class, or we have already seen how do we bind a class or interface into a container. Now we see binding instances. So to bind an existing object instance into the container, so we will be using instance method. And binding interfaces to implementations. So a very powerful feature of service container is its ability to bind an interface to a given implementation. So in this case we will be using bind method, and we will be passing whatever the interfaces are there, so as the parameters to the bind method. Contextual binding. So Sometimes we may have two classes that utilize the same interface, but we wish to inject different implementations into each class. So in those cases, we will be using contextual binding. So for this we will be using give method and also when method along with needs and give method. So contextual attributes. So contextual binding is often used to inject implementation of drivers or configuration values. Laravel offers a variety of contextual binding attributes that allow us to inject these types of values without manually defining the contextual bindings in our service providers. For example, storage attribute we want to bind, then we will be using hash symbol, hash storage of local protected file system, $file system. Like this we will be using hash symbol along with the attribute within the constructor of controller. So in addition to these storage attribute, Laravel offers auth, cache, config, db, log, route parameter and tag attributes. So Laravel provides current user attribute for injecting the currently authenticated user into a given route or class. So defining custom attributes. We can create our own contextual attributes by implementing contextual attribute contract interface. So like this we will be defining custom attributes. So in order to create custom attributes, we have to implement contextual attribute contract. So the container will call our attributes resolve method, which should resolve the value that should be injected into the class utilizing the attribute. Binding primitives. Sometimes we may have a class that receives some injected classes but also needs an injected primitive value such as an integer. So in those cases we will be using give method along with the $value. So sometimes a class may depend on an array of tagged instances. So using the give tagged method, we may easily inject all of the container bindings with the tag. So give tagged method will be used. So if you need to inject a value from one of our application's configuration files, we may use the give config method. Binding typed variadics. So we may have a class that receives an array of typed objects using a variadic constructor argument. So using contextual binding, so we may resolve this dependency by providing the give method with a closure that returns an array of resolved filter instances. So we may also just provide an array of class names to be resolved by the container. For example, whenever firewall needs filter instances. Variadic tag dependencies. So sometimes a class may have a variadic dependency that is a type hinted as a given class report $reports. So using the needs and the give tagged methods, you may easily inject all of the container bindings with the tag for the given dependency. Tagging. So occasionally we may need to resolve all of a certain category of binding. So in those cases tagging will be used by making use of tag method. So once the services have been tagged, we may easily resolve them via the container's tagged method. Extending bindings. So in order to extend bindings, we will be using extend method. So it allows the modification of resolved services. So we will be passing two arguments to the extend method, like the service class which we are extending, and a closure that should return the modified service. The closure service, the service being resolved on the container instance. So this is all about binding concept in Laravel. Next we see resolving concept. So we may use the make method to resolve a class instance from the container. So the make method accepts the name of the class or interface we wish to resolve. If some of our class's dependencies are not resolvable via the container, we may inject them by passing them as an associative array into the make with method. If some of our class dependencies are not resolvable via the container, via the service container, so we may inject them by passing them as an associative array into the make with method. Next we see the bound method. The bound method may be used to determine if a class or interface has been explicitly bound in the container. If you are outside of a service provider in a location of our code that does not have access to the $app variable, so we may use the app facade or the app helper to resolve a class instance from the container. If we would like to have the Laravel container instance itself injected into a class that is being resolved by the container, so we may type hint illuminate container class on our classes constructor. Automatic injection. So we may type in the dependency in the constructor of a class that is resolved by the container, including controllers, event listeners, middleware, and more. Now we see method invocation and injection. So sometimes we wish to invoke a method on an object instance while allowing the container to automatically inject that method's dependencies. So we may invoke the generate method via the container. The call method accepts any PHP callable. The container's call method may even be used to invoke a closure while automatically injecting its dependencies. Now we see container events. The service container fires an event each time it resolves an object, so we may listen to this event using the resolving method. So we can see the object being resolved will be passed to the callback, allowing us to set any additional properties on the object before it is given to its consumer. Rebinding. The rebinding method allows us to listen for when a service is rebound to the container, meaning it is registered again or overridden after its initial binding. So this can be useful when we need to update dependencies or modify behavior each time a specific binding is updated. PSR 11. So Laravel's service container implements the PSR 11 interface. So we may type into the PSR 11 container interface to obtain an instance of the Laravel container. So we will be using PSR 11 container interface to obtain an instance of Laravel container. So the exception is thrown if the given identifier can't be resolved. So the exception will be an instance of not found exception interface or container exception interface. So if the identifier was never bound, then the not found exception interface will be thrown. Suppose if the identifier is bound but unable to be resolved, then an instance of container exception interface will be thrown. So this is all about service container concept in Laravel. Thank you so much. This is Universal Horse Star Ravindar Reddy Yampalla. Thanks to all of my fans, supporters and followers. Special thanks to all of my YouTube subscribers. Thank you so much. So this is all about service container concept in Laravel. Thank you so much.